Okay, so imagine this. You're a doctor,
Right.
and you're great at what you do. You've been doing this for years, maybe even saved some lives along the way. You're confident.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden, bam, a lawsuit
Oh,
hits.
wow.
And it's all because of something you didn't write down, something you didn't document.
That's scary. It's like they say if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen.
Exactly. And it's more common than you might think. That's
Yeah.
why we're doing this deep dive today to explore the whole world of medical documentation. It's not just paperwork, it's your shield, your story, and honestly, it can save your sanity in the world of healthcare.
Absolutely. And a huge shout out to London Heartbeats Academy in the UK for their amazing support in bringing you this deep dive. They have over 140 courses on healthcare topics.
Oh, wow.
So definitely check them out. You can find them on Facebook, Instagram, Spotify, and YouTube.
So let's unpack this. Why is documentation such a big deal? We all know that saying if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. But what does that really mean for like a healthcare professional on the ground, in the thick of it?
Well, think about it. The medical record isn't just a formality, it's a legal document.
Oh, right.
And in the eyes of the law, what you document or what you don't document can have really serious consequences. The judiciary, they have a clear stance on this. The thing which is not documented has never happened.
So it's kind of like a doctor's best defense, almost like a legal safety net.
Precisely. Meticulous documentation, it can protect you from litigation, safeguard your reputation too, and maybe most importantly, it makes sure your patients get the best possible care.
Okay, so let's get real here. Can you give us an example of how this plays out in the real world, like a real case?
Yeah, absolutely. So the source material we're looking at today mentions this landmark case, the Kunal Saha case. Involved two hospitals, Beach Candy Hospital in Mumbai and AMRI Hospital in Kolkata. Now, Beach Candy, they had meticulous, detailed records, and that ended up protecting them from, legal repercussions.
Oh, wow.
But AMRI Hospital, they had some problems because their records weren't complete. They weren't consistent.
So one hospital's meticulous documentation served as their shield, while the other's lack of proper documentation, well, that left them vulnerable.
Exactly. And this wasn't just about paperwork. It potentially impacted the quality of care that the patient received. Imagine, trying to provide consistent, coordinated care when the medical record is incomplete
Right.
or unclear. It just leads to errors, miscommunication.
Yeah, definitely. There's also this other case mentioned where a surgery was considered to be done without consent just because the consent wasn't documented, even though the doctor had gotten consent.
Right, exactly. And that just highlights how important it is, even if you've done everything right clinically. If it's not documented, it's like it never happened.
Right.
Especially when it comes to things like informed consent. You can have that conversation, the patient can understand everything. But if it's not in the record, it's your word against theirs.
Yeah, that's a good point. So where does India stand in all of this? How are we doing on the documentation front?
Well, unfortunately, the current situation in India is being described as, well, dismal,
Oh,
which is a stark contrast to, say, the Western world. There, you often have dedicated medical secretaries managing the whole documentation process. We've got a ways to go.
okay. So if we're aiming for better documentation, let's break it down. What are the absolute essentials, the must-haves? Like what needs to be documented no matter what?
Think of it like you're painting a complete picture of the patient's journey.
Okay, yeah.
Start with their complaints, what they're telling you,
Right.
your initial diagnosis, what you think is going on, results from lab tests, of course, prescriptions, always using generic names for those,
Right.
and any notes from counseling sessions. And of course, anything to do with consent, procedures, treatments.
Okay, so it's not just jotting down a few quick notes. It's really about creating this comprehensive and chronological record of the whole patient journey.
Precisely. You should be able to follow the patient's story from the beginning to the end, and that needs a clear, consistent approach to documentation.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm really starting to see why this is so important, not just for the legal stuff, but for the overall care of the patient, too.
Absolutely. A well-documented medical record, it's a powerful tool. It's about communication, coordination, continuity of care, make sure everyone involved in the patient's care is on the same page, and it can really reduce the risk of errors.
Yeah, I see that. Speaking of errors, are there any common pitfalls, things that, healthcare professionals often get wrong when it comes to documentation?
Oh, there are actually quite a few.
Oh,
One of the biggest ones is not documenting things in a timely manner. You don't want to end up trying to reconstruct events after the fact from memory. Contemporaneous documentation, that's key. Write it down as it happens.
Okay, so no scribbling notes from memory later on, huh?
Exactly. There's a legal reason for that, too. Documentation done after a patient's been discharged, or worse, after they've passed away, it doesn't really hold up legally.
Oh, wow.
Raises doubts about the accuracy of your records.
So timing is everything, huh?
Pretty much. And this brings us to another common mistake. Rushing through it. Making careless errors.
What kind of errors are we talking about here?
Using abbreviations that can be misinterpreted, having handwriting that's just, impossible to read,
Oh, yeah.
or simply forgetting to document key information. These might seem like minor things, but they can have major consequences.
So it's not just what we document, it's how we document it. Clarity, accuracy, and all that attention to detail really matters.
Absolutely. And that's where a framework like the 5 C's of good documentation can be really useful.
The 5 C's, huh?
Yeah.
I'm intrigued. What are those?
Correct. Clear, comprehensive, chronological, and contemporaneous.
Okay, wow.
Think of those as your guiding principles, yeah?
Yeah.
To create a strong, reliable medical record.
Yeah. I love that. It's like a checklist for good documentation. Can you give an example of how one of these might actually play out in a real scenario?
Sure. Let's take Clear, for example. Imagine you're documenting a patient's meds. Now, you could just write down the brand names, but another healthcare provider might not be familiar with those specific brands.
Right.
Using the generic names, though, that makes sure everybody's on the same page.
Okay, yeah.
Removes any confusion.
That makes sense. It's about taking out any chance of, misunderstanding or misinterpreting something.
Exactly. This applies to everything you're documenting. The clearer and more precise it is, the better for both you and your patients.
Okay, so we've talked about what to document, the 5 C's, all that. But what about the consequences if we mess it up? What are the legal ramifications of poor documentation or incomplete records?
Well, legally speaking, that kind of documentation can lead to a lot of negative outcomes. Courts, they can draw negative conclusions from missing information.
Really?
And it becomes super hard to defend yourself against accusations of negligence or malpractice when your records aren't complete or accurate.
So it's not just about avoiding, a slap on the wrist. It's about protecting your whole career.
Precisely. And in some cases, you could even face penalties or disciplinary action from medical boards, especially when it comes to certain regulations, like the PCPNDT Act.
There's also that landmark judgment from 2020, Maharaja Agreeson Hospital versus Master Rishabh Sharma.
Right. That case, the Supreme Court of India explicitly said robust documentation is essential for ethical and responsible medical practice.
Oh, wow.
They even said that the absence of proper records can be seen as negligence.
Even if the care was good clinically.
Even then, it's a reminder that this is serious stuff.
Yeah, definitely. It's not just the courts, though, right? Medical boards, professional organizations, they're all emphasizing documentation more and more these days.
Absolutely. Failing to keep good records can really jeopardize your license to practice, not to mention damage your reputation and even lead to financial penalties.
So it's clear that good documentation, it's not just about dotting your I's and crossing your T's, it's about protecting your patients, your practice, and your peace of mind.
It really is. It's about recognizing the power of the medical record. It helps ensure continuity of care, prevents errors, improves communication, all leading to better patient safety and outcomes.
This has been incredibly insightful, honestly. I'm seeing documentation in a whole new light.
I'm glad to hear that. It's something that's often overlooked, but it's truly fundamental to good medical practice.
Well, before we move on, I just want to remind our listeners about London Heartbeat Z Academy again. They offer over 140 courses on healthcare topics.
Definitely a fantastic resource for healthcare professionals.
Absolutely. Be sure to check them out on Facebook, Instagram, Spotify, and YouTube. Stay up to date on all their latest offerings.
Now, we've talked about the legal risks of bad documentation, but what about the ethical implications? Documentation obviously deals with sensitive patient information.
Right.
So how do we make sure we're upholding patient confidentiality?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's where things can get a bit tricky. We have legal frameworks and guidelines, but it's also about understanding the principles behind confidentiality.
The NCDRC, for example, ruled that even a patient's spouse doesn't have automatic access to their medical records.
Oh, wow.
So, even someone that close.
So if a family member asks to see a patient's records, we can't just hand them over.
Not without the patient's consent. It's about respecting their autonomy and ensuring that their personal health information stays protected.
That makes sense. So we're diligently documenting, being careful about confidentiality, but how long do we actually have to keep these records for? Is there a set time frame?
That's a great question, and it's one that a lot of people trip up on because there's no single answer. It depends on various acts and guidelines.
Like what kind of acts?
Well, there's the MTP Act, the PNDT Act, the BMW Act. Even the Income Tax Act has rules about keeping records.
Wow.
There are the ICMR guidelines, the Surrogacy Bill, the Consumer Protection Act. The list goes on, really.
Sounds like navigating the legal side of documentation is a challenge.
It can be, but it's important to be aware of the specific requirements for keeping medical records. It all depends on the context.
But are there any general principles we can keep in mind?
Yeah.
Something to guide us through all these regulations?
Yeah, definitely. One key principle is to keep records for at least as long as the statute of limitations for malpractice claims in your jurisdiction.
Okay.
That can vary, but it's often several years. That way, you have the documentation if a claim is filed against you. Another important thing is to think about the future needs of the patient.
What do you mean by that?
Well, say a patient has a chronic condition, something that needs ongoing management. Keeping their records for a longer time might be better, just to ensure continuity of care.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's about balancing legal requirements, ethical considerations, and the practical needs of the patient.
Exactly. And if you're ever unsure about the specifics, it's always best to play it safe and talk to a legal professional who specializes in healthcare law.
Yeah, good advice. So we've established that keeping records for the right amount of time is important. What about giving access to those records? Do patients have a right to see their own medical records?
Yes, absolutely. Patients have a fundamental right to their own health information. That's in various legal and ethical frameworks.
But what happens when a patient requests their records and maybe our filing system isn't the best? Like, what if we're scrambling to find them? Is that a problem?
It can be, yeah. The MCI, they have guidelines that say medical records should be provided within 72 hours of a patient's request. Failing to meet that time frame, it can be seen as negligence
Oh, wow.
and a deficiency in service.
So it's not just about making good documentation. It's also about having systems in place to manage those records and make sure people can access them when they need to.
Exactly. A well-organized and easily accessible medical record system is essential for providing quality care and protecting yourself legally.
This has been really eye-opening. We've covered so much, from the legal and ethical stuff to the practical considerations of keeping records and giving access to them. But I think it's time to get into the nitty-gritty now.
Okay.
Let's talk about some of the common mistakes healthcare professionals make when it comes to documentation. What are some things we should be watching out for?
Well, there are quite a few pitfalls, and some of them might seem pretty basic. For instance, you know those decorative letterheads some doctors still use?
Yeah.
Those can actually raise questions about professionalism.
Really? I never thought about it that way.
It's all about presenting a professional image, and those letterheads can come off as a bit, frivolous.
Okay, I see that. What about listing qualifications on prescriptions? I've seen some doctors who put a whole bunch of degrees and certifications on there.
The MCI is very clear about that. Only your approved qualifications should be mentioned. Overdoing it with the qualifications can be seen as advertising, not really allowed in the medical profession.
Got it. So less is more when it comes to qualifications. What about something as basic as handwriting? I've seen some doctors whose handwriting is practically unreadable.
You're right, legibility is crucial. If your handwriting is hard to read, then the whole point of documentation is lost. Anyone who needs to look at those records should be able to understand them clearly.
Yeah, that's a good point. What are some other common documentation mistakes you see?
Incorrect dispensing details on prescriptions are a big one. Not giving patients enough information about their diagnosis or treatment plans or the potential side effects of medication. And then there's overprescribing certain drugs like steroids, which can be a red flag.
So it's not just about physically writing things down, it's about making sure the content of what we're documenting is accurate, complete, and easy for others to understand.
Exactly. And that brings us to another big no-no, abbreviations.
Oh, really? What's wrong with abbreviations? I thought those were helpful for saving time and space.
They might seem like a convenient shortcut, but they can introduce a lot of ambiguity and confusion. Remember, clarity is key in medical documentation.
Right.
You want to eliminate any chance of misinterpretation. That means spelling things out and using clear language.
So no more SOB for shortness of breath.
Exactly. It might be obvious to you, but someone else might interpret that differently. Could even lead to mistakes in care.
Okay, I'm definitely getting the message. Clarity is king.
Absolutely. And this goes for every part of documentation, from the language you use to the format you follow. The goal is to create a record that anyone can understand. Clear, concise, accurate, the whole 9 yards.
This has been really helpful, honestly. A great overview of the basics of good documentation and the common mistakes to avoid. But before we move on, I want to give another shout out to London Heartbeats Z Academy. They've got some fantastic resources on documentation best practices, including courses specifically designed to help healthcare professionals improve their documentation skills.
Definitely check them out. You can find them on Facebook, Instagram, Spotify, and YouTube. They're a treasure trove of information for anyone in the healthcare field.
Okay, so we've covered the legal risks of bad documentation. But now I want to get into some of the more nuanced aspects of documentation, the things that can really make or break a case if things go wrong.
All right.
So let's dig a little deeper, shall we? What are some of those subtle things that can make all the difference?
Well, one area that really needs extra attention is how we document the timing of events.
The timing.
Yeah, it's not just about what happened, but when it happened.
Yeah.
You have to be really precise about that
Okay, why is the timing so crucial?
because it can be super important when you're trying to figure out who's responsible or how a patient's condition changed over time. Imagine a situation where a patient gets worse really quickly and people start asking if the healthcare team responded quickly enough.
Right.
A clear and accurate timeline documented as things are happening that can be really strong evidence in these cases.
It's like piecing together a puzzle, where each piece is a moment in time, and the order of those pieces is super important to see the whole picture.
Exactly. And that's why contemporaneous documentation is so important. If you wait and try to remember the timeline later, you're much more likely to have gaps or inconsistencies.
Right.
And those gaps, they can make people doubt your whole record.
Okay, so if a nurse takes a patient's vitals at 10:00 a.m. and I see the patient at 10:15 a.m., I need to be very specific about documenting those times.
Exactly. Those details might seem small, but they can make a huge difference legally or when dealing with regulators.
It's like they say, the devil's in the details.
You got it. And it's not just about the timing of events, but also the content of what we write. Let's take operation notes, for example. I've seen cases where really skilled surgeons, they're a bit too brief in their descriptions of procedures.
Too brief, what do you mean?
Well, they might just say that a procedure was done without giving enough detail about what they found, the techniques they used, or any problems they ran into.
So just writing hysterectomy done isn't good enough.
Nope. You need to paint a clear picture of what happened during the procedure. Imagine you're explaining it to a colleague who wasn't there. What would they need to know?
Okay, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
It's about providing enough context and detail so anyone reading those notes understands exactly what went on.
Exactly. And that goes for any procedure. A laparoscopic cholecystectomy, a hysteroscopy, even a simple incision and drainage. The operation notes should tell the whole story from the first cut to the last stitch.
So we're not just saying we did something, but also how we did it, what we found, and if there were any issues along the way.
Precisely. Those details might not seem important at the time, but they can become really important if anyone ever questions the care that was given.
This makes a lot of sense now.
Hmm.
It's like we're building a case file, not just for potential legal problems, but for ourselves too, so we can look back and understand why we made the decisions we did.
That's a great way to put it. A good medical record is a powerful tool for learning and improving what we do.
So we've talked about good operation notes, but what about when things don't go as planned? What happens if there's a complication or a patient takes a turn for the worse?
That's when documentation becomes even more important. You want to be transparent and objective about what happened, the steps you took, and any communication with the patient and their family.
I imagine documenting those things can be tough emotionally.
Hmm.
How do we stay honest and professional when dealing with those situations?
It's all about finding a balance. You want to stick to the facts, avoid blaming anyone or expressing your own opinions or feelings. Focus on what happened when it happened, what you did, and what the outcome was.
So if a patient starts bleeding a lot during surgery, I would document how much blood they lost, how I stopped the bleeding, and if I consulted with any other specialist. But I wouldn't include my personal feelings about the situation.
That's right. Your feelings aren't relevant for the medical record. What matters is giving a clear account of the events and the decisions you made.
It's about separating the emotional from the factual.
Exactly. And remember, documenting complications isn't about admitting fault or making yourself vulnerable to lawsuits. It's about being transparent and accountable and learning from those experiences to do better for your patients.
It's about turning a negative into a positive.
That's it. And patients appreciate that honesty. When you're upfront with them about the tough stuff, it builds trust.
This is all really helpful. I'm really starting to grasp why documentation matters so much. It's not just about protecting ourselves, but about being accountable, transparent, and always striving to give our patients the very best care.
I couldn't agree more.
Before we move on, I just want to remind everyone about London Heartbeat C Academy. They have a ton of knowledge on all this stuff, including the best ways to document everything.
Yeah, definitely check them out. They have over 140 courses covering everything from the basics of documentation to more advanced stuff like electronic health records and telehealth.
You can find them on Facebook, Instagram, Spotify, and YouTube. Give them a follow and stay tuned for more awesome deep dives like this one.
So we've talked about documenting procedures and complications, but what about when a patient refuses a treatment or just won't cooperate with their care plan? How do we document those kinds of situations?
That's a good question. I've had patients who resist my recommendations, and it's tricky to know how to document those interactions. What's the best approach?
The key is to be clear and objective, just like with anything else. If a patient says no to a treatment, you recommend write down what treatment they refused, why they refused it, and your assessment of their ability to make that decision.
Okay, so if a patient refuses a blood transfusion because of their religious beliefs, I would write down what type of transfusions I offered, their reasons for refusing it, and my opinion on whether they understand the risks and benefits of getting a transfusion.
Exactly. You want to show that you respected their choice, but also that you did your job by giving them proper medical advice.
And what if a patient just isn't following their treatment plan, like not taking their meds? How do we handle that?
You have to document when they don't comply and write down what you did to try and encourage them to stick to the plan. Note what meds they're not taking, why they aren't taking them, and any risks that come with not taking them.
So if a patient with high blood pressure keeps forgetting to take their medication, I should document the specific medicine, the dose, how often they miss it, and any conversations we've had about the dangers of uncontrolled blood pressure.
Exactly. It's all about showing that you've tried to educate the patient, address their concerns, and reduce the risks associated with their actions.
It sounds like documentation is really important to protect both the patient and the provider in these cases.
Absolutely. Clear and thorough records can help show that you provided the right care even when a patient was being difficult. And it can be really important evidence if someone complains or a legal issue comes up.
So it's not just about protecting ourselves, but also making sure we're providing the best possible care, even when patients make choices we don't agree with.
Exactly. And remember, good documentation is a team effort. Get your whole team involved, nurses, pharmacists, everyone.
It's about building a culture of documentation.
Exactly. When everyone understands how important it is, it benefits everyone.
This has been really enlightening. I'm seeing documentation in a whole new light.
I'm glad to hear it. It's something people often overlook, but it's a crucial part of good medical practice.
Before we move on, I want to remind our listeners about London Heartbeat's Z Academy. They have so much knowledge and experience on all this stuff.
Absolutely. They offer over 140 courses on all kinds of healthcare topics, including the best ways to document everything.
You can find them on Facebook, Instagram, Spotify, and YouTube. Check them out and stay tuned for more deep dives like this one.
Okay, now let's talk about another situation where documentation is key: referrals. When we send patients to see other specialists, we need to document those referrals very carefully.
Why is that so important? Isn't it enough to just tell the patient to go see the specialist?
It might seem like enough, but there are a few reasons why it's important to document referrals. First, it makes sure everyone involved in the patient's care is on the same page. The specialist will know what you recommended, and you'll have a record for yourself.
So it's kind of like a paper trail to make sure nothing gets lost?
Exactly. Second, it clearly shows what you recommended and why you recommended it. This can be really important if someone questions the care you provided.
It's about being transparent and taking responsibility.
Right. And third, a good referral can help track the patient's progress. You can look back at it to see what you suggested, what tests or treatments were ordered, and how the patient did.
So we're not just writing down that we made a referral, but explaining why we made it, what we expect to happen, and how we plan to follow up.
Exactly. It's about giving a complete picture of the patient's experience with the healthcare system.
Okay, so what are the most important things to include in a referral?
Start with the basics: the date, the specialist's name and contact info, and the reason for the referral. Be clear and concise when explaining the reason.
So for example, if I'm sending a patient to a cardiologist, I might write, referral to Dr. Smith, cardiologist, for evaluation of new chest pain.
Exactly. You want the specialist to know exactly why you're sending the patient and what you're hoping they can do.
Is that all I need to write, or is there anything else?
You're right, there's more to it than just the basics. You should also include any special instructions or concerns you have. For example, if a patient has a complicated medical history, you might want to point out specific things the specialist should know.
So if my patient has a lot of allergies and bad reactions to medicine, I should mention that in the referral.
Absolutely. That kind of information is really important for the specialist to know right away. It can help them avoid problems and make a good treatment plan.
What if I'm worried about a specific symptom or something I found during an exam? Should I tell the specialist about that too?
Definitely. For instance, if you're sending a patient to a dermatologist to look at a mole that you're worried about, you should mention your concerns about how it looks and if it's changed recently.
It's about being proactive and making sure the specialist has all the information they need to do their best.
Exactly. And don't forget, the referral goes both ways. When the specialist sees the patient, they'll usually send you a report with their findings and suggestions.
So we should read those reports carefully
Yeah.
and document what we do next.
Right. Documenting the whole process from the initial referral to the follow-up care makes a complete record that's helpful for everyone.
This is so useful. I'm learning that even simple tasks like making a referral have a lot of hidden details when it comes to documentation.
It's true. And it shows how important it is to be thorough and pay attention to the little things when documenting everything.
Well, before we move on, I want to remind our listeners about London Heartbeat Z Academy again. They have a lot of great information on all this stuff.
Yes, they're a great resource for healthcare professionals. They have over 140 courses on all kinds of healthcare topics, including the best ways to document everything.
You can find them on Facebook, Instagram, Spotify, and YouTube. Make sure to check them out and stay tuned for more deep dives like this one.
Okay, so now let's talk about another tough situation, patients who decide to leave the hospital or stop treatment, even though we think it's not a good idea. This can be stressful for everyone, and it's really important to document everything carefully.
I can see that I've had a few cases like that, and it's always a little scary. What are the key things we need to document when a patient leaves against medical advice?
The most important thing is to write down exactly why the patient wants to leave. Use their own words, even if you don't agree with their decision.
So even if I think their reasons don't make sense, I should still write them down without judging them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not about whether you agree or not. It's about having a clear and neutral record of their choice.
Okay, that makes sense. What else should I be documenting?
Once you've written down their reasons, write down your assessment of whether they're able to make this decision. Are they alert and aware of what's going on? Do they understand the risks of leaving?
So if a patient is drunk or confused, I would write that down as part of my assessment.
That's right. You want to show that you were concerned and what you did to try and address those concerns. If you think the patient isn't able to make a good decision, write down why you're worried. And if you talk to any other healthcare professionals about it, like a psychiatrist or social worker,
What about the actual risks of leaving? How do we write those down?
you have to write down exactly what risks you talked about with the patient. Use language they can understand. For example, you might tell them that leaving early could make their infection worse or cause other problems.
So if someone with a bad infection wants to leave, I should write down that I explained they could get sicker or even die.
Yes. Be clear and specific and use language the patient can understand. Don't just list the risks, though. Write down anything you try to do to make those risks smaller.
What do you mean by that?
For example, let's say a patient with diabetes wants to leave before finishing their antibiotics. You could offer them a shorter course of antibiotics or tell them how to check their blood sugar at home.
So it's about being proactive and finding ways to keep them safe even when they're making a choice we don't like.
Exactly. It shows you're trying to do what's best for them, even when things are tough. And of course, you have to document that you told the patient about the possible consequences of leaving and that they signed a form saying they understand those risks.
It sounds like we're making sure we're protected and showing we acted responsibly even when it was a difficult situation.
That's right. And don't forget to write down any instructions you gave them for follow-up care, like when to see a doctor again or how to manage their condition at home.
So it's about making sure they know what to do next, even if they chose to leave against our advice.
Exactly. It's all about keeping the patient safe, even in tough situations.
This has been so helpful. I'm starting to see that documentation isn't just about paperwork. It's about communication being accountable and making sure our patients get the best possible care.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, what's the real takeaway here?
The bottom line is that good documentation is the foundation of good medical practice. It's not just about protecting ourselves, it's about protecting our patients, making sure they get consistent care, being transparent and accountable, and making healthcare better for everyone.
It's about understanding that everything we write in a medical record, every signature, every date and time, can affect a patient's life.
That's right. Every time we write in a patient's chart or open their electronic record, we're holding their story in our hands. We have a responsibility to tell that story accurately, respectfully, and carefully.
That's a powerful thought. It makes you realize that documentation isn't just a chore, it's about connecting with our patients and remembering the responsibility we have.
Absolutely. It's about seeing the medical record as more than just facts and numbers. It's the story of a person's health, and we get to help write that story.
This has been eye-opening. I have a whole new understanding of why documentation is so important.
I'm glad to hear that. It's something
Mm.
people often forget about, but it's really at the core of being a good doctor. One area that often trips people up is medication management. Documenting prescriptions carefully is super important, and there are some details you need to know.
Like what?
For starters, always use the generic name for the drug, not the brand name.
Oh, really? Why is that so important? I know some doctors who like to use brand names because they think it's easier for patients to understand.
There are a couple of reasons why using generic names is better. First, it keeps things consistent and avoids confusion, especially if a patient has multiple doctors or goes to different pharmacies. Second, it helps avoid conflicts of interest. We don't want to look like we're promoting certain brands. Remember, our main responsibility is to the patient, not to drug companies.
That makes sense. It's about putting the patient first and making sure the information is clear.
Exactly. And when you're writing a prescription, be sure to include the dose, how to take it, how often, and for how long. Don't leave anything out.
So instead of just writing amoxicillin 500 milligrams, I should write amoxicillin 500 milligram capsules, take one capsule by mouth 3 times a day for 7 days.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That level of detail is important to make sure the patient takes the right medicine the right way and for the right amount of time. It also helps prevent mistakes.
What if a patient isn't taking their medicine like they should? How do we document that?
It's important to document every time this happens and also write down what you did to talk to the patient about why it's important to take their medicine. Write down their reasons for not taking it if they're willing to tell you, and any risks associated with not following the treatment plan.
So if a patient with diabetes keeps forgetting to take their insulin, I should write down the type of insulin, the dose, how many times they missed it, and any conversations we've had about the dangers of high blood sugar.
Exactly. It's about making it clear that you talked to the patient and trying to educate them about their treatment.
It's about being a partner in their care, even when it's hard.
Precisely. And if there are any bad reactions to the medicine or complications from taking it, those need to be documented too, along with how you handled them. Remember, the medical record is all about communication, and clear documentation helps everyone provide safe and effective care.
This has been really helpful.
Hmm.
I'm realizing that even simple things like writing prescriptions can have a lot of hidden details.
That's true. And it just shows how important it is to keep learning and stay updated on the best ways to document everything. Documentation can really make a difference for both the patient and the doctor.
I see what you mean. Talking to a patient is one thing, but writing it down accurately is another.
Exactly. And this is especially important when dealing with serious or complicated medical issues. When you're documenting these conversations, focus on what the patient understood and how they reacted to the information.
So if I'm telling a patient they have cancer, I would not only write down the diagnosis, but also how they reacted, any questions they asked, and my answers.
That's right. It's about showing that you took the time to explain things clearly and thoroughly, and that you address their specific worries and needs.
And what if a patient refuses a treatment I recommend? How do we document that to protect both of us?
It's really important to document these cases clearly and objectively, just like you would with anything else. If a patient refuses a treatment, write down exactly what they refused, why they refused it, and whether you think they're capable of making that decision.
Okay, so if a patient with a heart problem doesn't want to have an angiogram, I would write down what procedure I offered, their reason for saying no, and whether I think they understand the risks and benefits of the procedure.
Exactly. You want to show that you respected their choice while also doing your job by giving them good medical advice.
What if there are language barriers or cultural differences that make communication difficult? How do we make sure the documentation accurately shows what the patient understood?
That's a really good question, and it highlights the importance of being aware of the patient's individual needs. If there are language problems, use a qualified interpreter whenever you can and write down their name and qualifications in the medical record. If there are cultural differences that might affect how they make decisions or understand things, be respectful and document your efforts to overcome those
So
differences.
it's not just about the facts, but also about how those facts were communicated and understood.
Exactly. Good documentation means giving a complete picture of the whole situation, including the little details of communication and the patient's personal circumstances.
This has been so insightful. I'm starting to realize that documentation is so much more than just paperwork. It's about communication showing our thought process and proving that we put the patient first.
Take their insulin, I would document the specific type of insulin, the prescribed dosage, the frequency of missed doses, and any conversations I've had with the patient about the potential consequences of uncontrolled blood sugar.
Exactly. It's all about making it clear that you talk to the patient and try to educate them about their treatment.
Precisely. And if there are any bad reactions to the medicine or complications from taking it, those need to be documented too, along with how you handled them. Let's talk about communication with patients, especially when explaining diagnoses, treatment options, and potential risks and benefits. This is where documentation can really make a difference for both the patient and the doctor.
I see what you mean. Talking to a patient is one thing, but writing it down accurately is another.
Exactly. And this is especially important when dealing with serious or complicated medical issues. When you're documenting these conversations, focus on what the patient understood and how they reacted to the information.
So if I'm telling a patient they have cancer, I would not only write down the diagnosis, but also how they reacted, any questions they asked, and my answers.
That's right. It's about showing that you took the time to explain things clearly and thoroughly, and that you addressed their specific worries and needs.
And what if a patient refuses a treatment I recommend? How do we document that to protect both of us?
It's really important to document these cases clearly and objectively, just like you would with anything else. If a patient refuses a treatment, write down exactly what they refused, why they refused it, and whether you think they're capable of making that decision.
Okay, so if a patient with a heart problem doesn't want to have an angiogram, I would write down what procedure I offered, their reason for saying no, and whether I think they understand the risks and benefits of the procedure.
Exactly. You want to show that you respected their choice while also doing your job by giving them good medical advice.
What if there are language barriers or cultural differences that make communication difficult? How do we make sure the documentation accurately shows what the patient understood?
That's a really good question, and it highlights the importance of being aware of the patient's individual needs. If there are language problems, use a qualified interpreter whenever you can, and write down their name and qualifications in the medical record. If there are cultural differences that might affect how they make decisions or understand things, be respectful and document your efforts to overcome those differences.
So it's not just about the facts, but also about how those facts were communicated and understood.
Exactly. Good documentation means giving a complete picture of the whole situation, including the little details of communication and the patient's personal circumstances.
This has been so insightful. I'm starting to realize that documentation is so much more than just paperwork. It's about communication, showing our thought process, and proving that we put the patient first.
I love that. It really is a skill that you can get better at over time with practice and attention to detail.
Speaking of improving our skills, I want to thank London Heartbeat Z Academy one last time for their help with this deep dive. They've been amazing, and I recommend all our listeners to check out their website and social media for more info on their awesome courses.
You can find them on Facebook, Instagram, Spotify, and YouTube. Follow them and see what they have to offer. They have over 140 healthcare courses, and they're always having great discussions like this one.
This deep dive into the world of medical documentation has really highlighted its importance. It's more than just paperwork. It's about patient safety, clear communication, and ultimately better health care for everyone. And remember, those clear, accurate records, they're not just good for your patients, they protect you too. So keep those 5 C's in mind and keep striving for excellence in everything you do. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.